The Gecko That Glows in the Dark, written and illustrated by Ottley. Gavin lived in a silly town, up on the top of a hill, a gathering spot for animals around the globe. It was called Giggly Go Gatherville. He lived here with his grandma, who was gentle, gracious, and good. In the evenings, he'd leave town to gather gooseberries and ginkgo wood. While out one day came a gust of wind, something that wasn't the norm. It got dark and gloomy very quickly, and in rolled a ghostly storm. Now Gavin was no ordinary gecko, but a glistening, gleaming, glow-in-the-dark gecko. As it got dark, he glowed bright, the perfect gift for a stormy night. The gravity of the storm seemed a big deal, so he headed back to Giggly Go Gatherville. But along the way, a giant giraffe who was grazing grass from the storm was now lost and alone. Gavin shined like gold, and the giraffe was cold, so he asked if he'd guide him home. The giraffe lived in the same town, past the growing garden farm. Gavin the glowing gecko agreed to take him home where it was warm. So the glowing gecko and giant giraffe prepared to climb the hill to get to the growing garden in Giggly Go Gatherville. But along the way, a grumpy goat who griped and moped was also lost and alone. Gavin shined like a gem, so the goat grew a grin and asked if he'd guide him home. The goat lived in the same town by the gripless glacier bend. Gavin the glowing gecko agreed, so he joined and followed them. So the glowing gecko, giant giraffe, and grumpy goat prepared to climb the hill to get to the growing garden and gripless glacier in Giggly Go Gatherville. But along the way, a graceful gazelle who wasn't feeling well was galloping lost and alone. Gavin glistened like a star and glowed from afar, so she asked if he'd guide her home. The gazelle lived in the same town, near the gurgling geyser spot. Gavin the glowing gecko agreed. I'll help them all, he thought. So the glowing gecko, giant giraffe, grumpy goat, and graceful gazelle prepared to climb the hill to get to the growing garden, gripless glacier, and gurgling geyser in Giggly Go Gatherville. But along the way, a goofy gopher who was wearing loafers was also lost and alone. Gavin shined like glitter, so the tiny critter asked if he'd guide him home. The gopher lived in the same town under the gooey green grapevines. Gavin the glowing gecko agreed, so the gopher got in line. So the glowing gecko, giant giraffe, grumpy goat, graceful gazelle, and goofy gopher prepared to climb the hill to get to the growing garden, gripless glacier, gurgling geyser, and gooey grapes in Giggly Go Gatherville. But along the way, a glamorous goose, who would be the caboose, was also lost and alone. Gavin shined like a ring, so she asked if he'd bring her along to guide her home. The goose lived in the same town under the golden grand city gate. Gavin the glowing gecko agreed, and the gray goose said, "That's great." So the glowing gecko, giant giraffe, grumpy goat, graceful gazelle, goofy gopher, and glamorous goose prepared to climb the hill to get to the growing garden, gripless glacier, gurgling geyser, gooey grapes, and golden gate in Giggly Go Gatherville. So Gavin gathered the group together to guide them safely home, and one by one he dropped them off until he was all alone. His last stop was his own house. His grandma greeted him at the gate. He told her of the friends he guided home. She smiled and said, "That's great." Everyone has their struggles. They may be lost or alone as can be, but you can be a light to them when it's dark and they're unable to see. You don't have to glow in the dark to brighten others' days. Be kind to others and you will discover you glow in your own special way. His grandma gave him some guava juice. Gavin drank it, then hugged her tight. She kissed his head, tucked him into his bed, hit the lights, and whispered, "Good night."